My husband looked down at my weeping surgical incision and told me to stop playing the fragile princess. I had just survived a grueling spinal fusion surgery and was barely discharged from the hospital when the front door of my home flew open. In marched his mother, his sister, her husband, and 17 other relatives, dragging heavy suitcases across my pristine hardwood floors. My husband snatched my prescribed pain medication right out of my trembling hands, placed the bottle on a high shelf I could not possibly reach, and demanded I get up to season the ribs for his family. He thought I was helpless and trapped. He had no idea that while he was busy entertaining his blood relatives using my hard-earned money, I was already orchestrating the absolute legal and financial destruction of his entire existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who tried to break you when you were at your most vulnerable. The throbbing ache in my lower back was a constant blinding reminder of the titanium screws currently holding my spine together. It had only been 3 days since the surgeons had fused my L4 and L5 vertebrae. The custom medical brace wrapped tightly around my torso felt like a cage of hard plastic and Velcro pressing against my bruised skin. My incision was still fresh, occasionally weeping fluid through the thick white bandages taped to my lower back. The doctor had given me strict orders: absolute bed rest, no bending, no lifting, and definitely no stress. I had strategically positioned myself on the deep cushions of my living room sofa, trying to find a single angle where the fiery nerve pain would subside. The house was quiet, the afternoon sun filtering through the sheer curtains of my Atlanta home, casting a warm glow over the sanctuary I had spent years paying for and designing. That fragile piece shattered with a violent crash. The heavy oak front door was kicked open with such force that the brass handles slammed into the drywall, leaving a deep dent. I flinched the sudden movement, sending a shockwave of white-hot agony straight down my sciatic nerve. I gasped, gripping the edge of the sofa cushions as the cold winter air rushed into the foyer, followed immediately by a wall of deafening noise. Loud voices overlapping laughter. The aggressive clatter of plastic luggage wheels grinding against my imported hardwood floors. It sounded like a bustling airport terminal had suddenly relocated directly into my living room. I struggled to lift my head, my vision swimming from the pain, and watched in absolute horror as a sea of people flooded through my front door. Kendrick, my husband of 4 years, strode in first. He did not look at me. He did not ask how my pain levels were doing. Instead, he turned back toward the driveway, waving his hands and shouting instructions to the swarm of people behind him. In walked Brenda, his mother, a woman who carried her entitlement like a weapon. Close behind her was Monique, my perpetually bitter sister-in-law, dragging her 2 screaming toddlers by their wrists. Then came Trent, Monique's white husband, loudly complaining about the humidity. And behind them, a seemingly endless parade of aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives I barely recognized. 21 people in total swarming into my home, dropping heavy duffel bags, tossing muddy shoes onto the rugs, and shouting over each other to claim the best bedrooms upstairs. I tried to speak to demand an explanation, but my throat was dry from the heavy painkillers I had taken hours ago. I had begged Kendrick just yesterday to postpone this massive family reunion. I had wept, explaining the severity of my spinal surgery and pleading for just 1 week of peace so my surgical wounds could close. He had looked at me with cold, dead eyes and told me no one was waiting and that I just needed to do as I was told. I thought he was bluffing. I thought surely no one would be cruel enough to invite 24 people into a house where a woman was practically bedridden and bleeding. I was wrong. Brenda marched straight past the entryway, ignoring the shoe rack, her hard leather boots clicking sharply against the floorboards. She spotted me lying on the sofa. There was no greeting, no expression of sympathy for the massive medical brace holding my body together. Instead, she unbuttoned her heavy, damp winter coat, marched right up to where I was laying, and threw the massive garment directly onto my legs. The sheer weight of the heavy wool landing on my lower half jerked my hips downward. The sudden shift tore at my fresh incision. A sharp, involuntary scream ripped from my throat as the pain blinded me. Brenda did not even blink. She stood over me, her hands planted firmly on her hips, looking down her nose with an expression of pure disgust. "How long are you going to lay there?" Brenda demanded, her voice echoing shrilly over the chaos of her family, destroying my entryway. "Get up and go to the kitchen to season the ribs and prep the chicken. We just flew in from Chicago. On a budget airline, we are exhausted, and we are starving. Stop playing the fragile princess, and do your duty as a wife." I stared at her, my vision blurring with tears of pure physical agony. My lungs constricted. I could barely draw enough breath to speak. "Mom." I gasped out, my hands trembling as I tried to push the heavy coat off my legs without twisting my spine. "I just had major surgery. My back is cut open. I cannot walk without a frame. I cannot cook." Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically, sucking her teeth with a loud dismissive sound. "Please. My cousin had back surgery and was back at work in 2 days. You just want an excuse to be lazy and avoid serving this family. We are guests in my son Yu's house, and you are being completely disrespectful." I looked desperately past her, searching for the man who was supposed to protect me. Kendrick had just walked into the living room carrying a massive cooler of alcohol. Our eyes met. I expected him to intervene to remind his mother about the titanium hardware newly screwed into my bones. Instead, he set the cooler down and let out a heavy, irritated sigh. "Kendrick, please," I begged, my voice breaking. The coat pulled on my legs. "I need my pain medication. It is in my purse on the counter. Please, the pain is too much." I managed to reach my trembling hand toward my purse sitting on the coffee table. Inside was the small amber bottle of prescription painkillers the hospital had carefully rationed for my recovery. My fingers barely brushed the leather strap of the bag before Kendrick stepped forward. He did not reach down to help me. He did not comfort me. He reached into my purse, pulled out the amber bottle of pills, and looked at the label. "I told you yesterday," Kendrick said, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper that only I and his mother could hear. "All 21 members of my family are staying here for 2 weeks. They came all this way to celebrate our family reunion. Do not embarrass me in front of my blood." He turned his back on my tear-stained face, walked over to the built-in custom bookshelf on the far wall, and placed my bottle of pain medication on the very top shelf. A shelf that was at least 7 feet off the ground. A shelf I could not possibly reach without standing on a chair, bending and stretching movements that the surgeons explicitly warned would rip my spinal fusion apart and paralyze me. "Get up and clean the kitchen," Kendrick commanded coldly, not even looking back at me. "You can have your pills when the food is prepped." I lay there completely paralyzed by the psychological blow. The physical pain radiating from my spine was nothing compared to the absolute devastation crushing my chest. This was the man who had vowed to love and protect me in sickness and in health. He was purposefully using my agonizing physical pain as leverage to force me into serving his family. He was torturing me in my own home to look like a dominant provider in front of his mother. The house around me descended into absolute madness. I could hear his aunts and uncles upstairs opening doors, loudly complaining about the thread count of my expensive sheets and demanding to know where the extra towels were. Children were sprinting down the hallways, their heavy footsteps vibrating through the ceiling and sending dull aches down my spine. The sanctuary I had paid for the home I maintained with my own intense work schedule had been completely hijacked. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to regulate my breathing to manage the overwhelming spikes of nerve pain. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself to think clearly. Panic would only make the physical agony worse. That was when Trent walked into the room. Trent was Monique's husband. He was a man who walked through life with an unearned sense of supreme confidence, heavily relying on his white privilege while simultaneously leeching off the success of anyone around him. He fancied himself a brilliant tech entrepreneur, though he had never successfully launched a single project. He was loud, arrogant, and notoriously comfortable making backhanded, offensive comments disguised as jokes. Trent strolled into my living room holding a half-eaten sandwich he had already scavenged from my refrigerator. He was wearing heavy, thick-soled hiking boots, completely caked in dried, crusty mud from the driveway. He did not pause at the entryway rug. He tracked a trail of thick brown dirt directly across my imported rugs. He stopped right in front of the seating area. Without missing a beat, he turned around and dropped his muddy, filthy boots directly onto the cushions of my custom-imported velvet armchair. It was an $8,000 chair I had waited 6 months to have shipped from Italy. "Nice place you got here, bro, Trent," called out to Kendrick, chewing loudly with his mouth open. "A little quiet, though. And the Wi-Fi signal in the guest room is absolute garbage." He finally looked down at me, lying rigid on the sofa in my bulky medical brace. He did not show an ounce of concern. Instead, a condescending smirk spread across his face. "Hey, Justine," Trent said, waving his half-eaten sandwich at me. "Stop lounging around. Be a good host. Get me the Wi-Fi password, and while you are up, grab me a cold beer from the fridge. Though looking at you right now, your attitude seems a little too typical for your kind. Always acting hostile when people expect a little basic hospitality." The blatant, ugly microaggression hung in the air. The heavy implication behind his words, the way he sneered at me in my own home while destroying my furniture with his muddy boots, was a deliberate challenge. He was testing the waters to see exactly how much disrespect he could get away with. I looked past Trent, my eyes locking onto Kendrick, my husband. The man who should have immediately thrown Trent out the front door for speaking to his injured wife that way. Kendrick just threw his head back and laughed. He actually laughed. He clapped Trent on the shoulder, handing him a fresh beer he had grabbed himself. "Do not mind her, Trent," Kendrick said loudly, making sure the rest of the relatives in the kitchen could hear him. "She just likes to play the victim. We will get her trained right eventually." The laughter from the kitchen echoed into the living room. Brenda was cackling loudly, agreeing with her son. Monique was snickering while her children continued to tear through my house. They were all participating in the public humiliation. They were feeding off my absolute vulnerability, treating my home like a conquered territory, and treating me like the defeated enemy. They thought they had won. They thought that because I was physically broken, immobilized by titanium screws and radiating nerve pain, that I was completely powerless. They saw a woman crying on a sofa, stripped of her pain medication and surrounded by 21 hostile invaders. But as I lay there staring at Trent's muddy boots ruining my velvet chair, the tears stopped falling. The warm, desperate sadness that had been suffocating me instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, terrifying clarity. My breathing slowed. My mind, usually clouded by the heavy painkillers, suddenly snapped into razor-sharp focus. Kendrick had just made the greatest miscalculation of his entire life. He believed his title as husband gave him ownership over my home, my resources, and my dignity. He forgot who he was actually married to. He forgot whose name was truly on the deed to this $3 million estate. And more importantly, he forgot that a woman trapped on a sofa with nothing but her laptop and a secure Wi-Fi connection is the most dangerous entity on the planet. I did not scream. I did not argue. I simply looked at the high shelf where my pain medication sat, and I made a silent promise to myself. By the time this family reunion was over, none of these people would have a roof over their heads, and Kendrick would be begging for mercy in a federal courtroom. The noise in my living room became a suffocating blanket of chaos as Kendrick's family spread through my home like a swarm of locusts. I remained perfectly still on the sofa, forcing my breathing to stay shallow and even to prevent my spinal brace from shifting. Trent left his muddy boots resting on my expensive velvet chair and swaggered into the kitchen to join the others. The sound of my heavy oak cabinets being slammed shut echoed through the open floor plan. They were opening every drawer, inspecting every pantry shelf, and tearing into the expensive groceries I had ordered for my surgical recovery. Children were screaming and running laps around the kitchen island, their heavy footsteps sending fresh waves of agony shooting up my spine. I watched in disbelief as Monique allowed her 2 toddlers to race into the formal dining room, carrying sticky pieces of fried chicken they had pulled from a takeout box. My dining room was decorated with custom silk drapes and fragile imported ceramics. I tried to call out to her, but my voice was completely drowned out by the blasting volume of the television. Kendrick had grabbed the remote and turned on a sports game, cranking the sound system so loud the bass vibrated through the floorboards. I could feel the vibrations in the titanium screws in my back. Then came the sound of glass shattering. A loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the sudden silence of the toddlers. I gritted my teeth, pushing through the blinding pain to lift my head. One of the children had knocked over a hand-blown glass sculpture I had purchased during a trip to Venice. It was in 1,000 pieces on the floor. Monique strolled over, looked at the destroyed art, and simply clicked her tongue. She did not apologize. She did not offer to clean it up. She just grabbed her child by the arm and muttered that people should not leave dangerous glass things around where kids could get hurt. She actually blamed me for her children destroying my property. I looked toward the kitchen, hoping Kendrick had heard the crash. He was standing by the marble counter, surrounded by his uncles. He was reaching into my locked liquor cabinet, holding a bottle of aged scotch that I had received as a corporate gift from a major client. It was a bottle that cost over $2,000. Kendrick cracked the seal without a second thought and began pouring generous measures into my crystal glasses, playing the role of the wealthy, generous host. He laughed loudly, slapping his uncle on the back, soaking up their praise while I lay bleeding and paralyzed just 15 feet away. The true nightmare began when Brenda marched out of the kitchen and headed straight for the grand staircase. She was loudly declaring to the rest of the aunts that she was taking the master bedroom because the matriarch of the family deserved the best mattress. My heart pounded against my ribs. The master bedroom was my sterile sanctuary. It was where my medical supplies, my clean bandages, and my specialized wedge pillows were carefully arranged for my recovery. "Mom, you cannot go in there," I managed to say, my voice cracking with desperation. "My medical equipment is in there. It is a sterile environment." Brenda paused on the stairs, looking down at me with an expression of pure contempt. She scoffed loudly. "I am the mother of the man who owns this house. I sleep where I want. You can sleep on the couch since you love laying around so much." She turned and marched up the stairs. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the hardwood floors upstairs. I forced myself to move. The pain was so severe my vision went black at the edges, but I had to protect my medical supplies. I slowly rolled onto my side, biting my lip to keep from screaming as the fused vertebrae ground together. I reached for my metal walker, which someone had kicked into the corner. My fingers shook as I gripped the handles and pulled myself up. Sweat poured down my face, blending with my tears. Every step felt like a knife twisting in my lower back. It took me 10 agonizing minutes to slowly drag my walker to the base of the stairs. I looked up just in time to see a plastic bin come tumbling down the carpeted steps. It bounced and crashed, landing right at my feet. My sterile gauze, my antiseptic wipes, my medical tape, and my surgical sponges spilled out across the floor. Some of the sterile packaging tore open, rendering the expensive medical supplies completely useless and exposing me to the risk of severe infection. Brenda stood at the top of the landing, wiping her hands together like she had just taken out the trash. "The hospital smell in that room makes me nauseous," she announced loudly. "I am not sleeping in a room that smells like a sick ward. I cleared out all your little medical toys. You need to find somewhere else to put your junk." I stared at the ruined supplies at my feet. These were the materials keeping my open wound from becoming infected. They were keeping me alive. My mother-in-law had just thrown them down the stairs because the faint smell of rubbing alcohol bothered her. I looked up at her standing triumphantly in the hallway of the house my money had bought, and I realized she was actively trying to harm me. I slowly turned my walker around the pain, now a roaring fire in my nerve endings. I knew I could not make it back to the living room sofa. The kids had already claimed it, jumping on the cushions with their dirty shoes. The only room left on the ground floor was my home office. It was a small room off the hallway where I ran my cybersecurity firm. I dragged my walker inch by inch, feeling the fluid from my surgical incision slowly weeping through my bandages, making my shirt damp. I managed to reach the office and shut the heavy wooden door behind me, muffling the chaotic sounds of the 21 people destroying my house. The room was small, containing only my desk, my heavy computer monitors, and a small closet. There was no bed. There was no sofa. There was only a thin camping air mattress stuffed in the back of the closet from a trip years ago. My hands were completely numb from the pain, but I managed to pull the deflated mattress out and spread it across the floor. I plugged in the small electric pump and let it fill with air. The mattress was only a few inches off the hard wooden floor. For a spinal fusion patient, sitting down on a low surface is dangerous. Lying down on the floor without assistance is almost impossible. I stood over the thin mattress, trembling uncontrollably. I had no choice. I slowly lowered myself to my knees, crying out as the surgical staples pulled at my flesh. I collapsed onto the cold plastic surface of the air mattress, staring up at the ceiling. The indignity of the situation washed over me. I was a highly successful tech executive, the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar property, and I was lying on a cheap plastic air mattress on the floor of my own office, while my husband threw a luxury party for his toxic family using my money and my resources. Hours passed. The sun went down and the noise in the house only grew louder. I could hear the heavy thumping of bass from the stereo system. I could hear Kendrick's loud booming laugh echoing through the ventilation grates. He was having the time of his life. He was basking in the adoration of his family, completely ignoring the fact that his wife was locked in a dark room bleeding and in unimaginable pain. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I opened my messages and texted Kendrick. "Please," I wrote, "I need my medication. It is on the top shelf in the living room. I am in so much pain I cannot breathe. Please bring me my pills." The message showed as delivered. Then it showed as read. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. Nobody came to the door. Kendrick had read my message for help and actively chosen to ignore it. He was too busy pouring expensive scotch and showing off to his uncles to bring his wife the medication she desperately needed to survive the night. The physical pain was becoming unbearable, but the emotional pain was a different kind of agony. The man I had trusted with my life was willingly participating in my torture. I lay in the dark listening to the sounds of my house being ransacked by strangers. I focused on my breathing, trying to ride out the intense waves of nerve spasms. I did not cry anymore. Tears were a waste of energy, and I needed all my energy for what was coming next. I mentally cataloged everything in my office. My secure servers, my encrypted laptops, my financial documents. Everything I needed to dismantle Kendrick's entire life was right here in this room with me. They had banished me to the very place where my power was absolute. I must have passed out from the sheer exhaustion and pain, because the next thing I knew, the room was completely black. The noise outside the office door had finally died down. The house was quiet save for the heavy snoring of an uncle sleeping on the living room sofa. I woke up with a sharp gasp. The pain in my back was no longer a dull throb. It was a blinding, piercing shriek that stole the breath right out of my lungs. My body was covered in a cold sweat. The medication from the hospital had completely worn off hours ago. I tried to shift my weight on the deflated air mattress, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive. Panic flared in my chest. I reached out into the darkness, fumbling for my phone on the floor beside me. I needed the harsh light of the screen to ground myself, to distract my brain from the physical torture. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the phone, and I brought it up to my face. The bright screen illuminated the small dark office. The time read 2:14 in the morning. There was a notification resting on my lock screen. It was an automated email alert from my primary banking institution. The subject line was bold and immediate, indicating a high-priority security notice. I blinked, trying to clear my blurry vision. My banking app was set up with strict security protocols. Any transaction over a certain amount triggered an immediate alert. I tapped the notification, ignoring the trembling in my hands, and the app opened to my private financial dashboard. This was not the joint account I shared with Kendrick for household expenses. This was my personal secure medical savings account. It was a dedicated fund I had built over the years, specifically designed to cover my spinal surgery, my upcoming physical therapy, the private nursing care I was supposed to have, and months of necessary recovery expenses. I stared at the screen and my heart stopped beating. The balance, which had been sitting comfortably at over $150,000 just yesterday, now displayed a terrifying number: 0. The entire account had been drained. A single massive wire transfer had been initiated and pushed through the system late in the evening while I was locked in this room. I tapped on the transaction details, my breathing completely suspended. The transfer had been authorized using my digital signature and routed directly into an external account. An account that I did not recognize, an account that was absolutely not mine. My emergency medical savings, the money meant to keep me alive and help me walk again, was gone. I lay perfectly still on the deflated air mattress in the dark. The agonizing pain radiating from my spine suddenly faded into the background, replaced by a chilling, profound silence in my mind. They had not just invaded my home. They had not just humiliated me and endangered my physical safety. Someone in this house, while drinking my liquor and sleeping in my bed, had just stolen my lifeline. They had taken everything. And in doing so, they had just signed their own absolute destruction. The morning sun crawled across the floor of my cramped office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I had not slept a single second since seeing that zero balance on my phone screen. My mind had been racing through 1,000 different scenarios, calculating every possible angle, while my spine throbbed with a relentless burning ache. The house above me began to stir around 10 in the morning. The heavy thud of footsteps, the loud booming voices of Kendrick's uncles, and the screeching of toddlers echoing down the hallway. I lay there on that deflated air mattress, listening to the invaders taking over my home. Around noon, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The chaotic noise changed into a bizarre kind of excited murmuring. I could hear the heavy front door opening and closing repeatedly. Strange voices, men speaking in polite professional tones, were directing traffic in my foyer. The unmistakable clatter of heavy metal chafing dishes being set up on my marble kitchen island drifted into the office. The smell of rich garlic butter, roasted meats, and exotic spices began to seep under my door, completely overpowering the stale air of the small room. I knew I had to get up. I had to see exactly what Kendrick was doing with the money he had stolen from my literal life support fund. Getting off the floor was an exercise in pure physical torture. I rolled onto my stomach, digging my elbows into the hardwood floor, and slowly pushed my upper body up. My back muscles spasmed violently, threatening to tear the fresh stitches right out of my skin. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted copper, letting the physical pain anchor me. I grabbed the metal frame of my walker and hauled myself upright, my legs shaking uncontrollably beneath the weight of my medical brace. I pushed the office door open and dragged my walker down the short hallway toward the kitchen. The sight that greeted me was sickening. My massive kitchen island was covered edge to edge in luxury catering displays. Professional servers in crisp white chef coats were arranging towering seafood boils, overflowing with colossal Alaskan king crab legs, jumbo shrimp, and bright red lobster tails. On the other side of the island, a carving station had been set up, featuring massive slabs of perfectly marbled Wagyu beef. Silver buckets filled with crushed ice held bottles of Dom Perignon champagne. It was a feast fit for royalty, an extravagant display of wealth that must have cost thousands upon thousands of dollars for a party of 21 people. The relatives were swarming the food, their plates piled high with expensive cuts of meat and seafood. Brenda was standing near the champagne holding a crystal flute, laughing loudly with her sisters about how successful her son had become. Monique was filling plates for her toddlers, not caring as butter and sauce dripped onto my expensive Persian rugs. Kendrick stood at the center of it all, wearing a crisp designer linen shirt, acting like a billionaire philanthropist hosting a charity gala. He was gesturing broadly, handing out plates and accepting the continuous stream of praise from his hungry family. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, leaning heavily on my walker, my hospital gown stained with weeping fluid. No one offered me a plate. No one asked if I was hungry. "Kendrick," I said, my voice raspy but loud enough to cut through the chatter. I slowly pushed my walker forward, forcing the crowd of relatives to part slightly. Kendrick turned to look at me, his smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a hard mask of irritation. "What is all this?" I asked, staring at the Wagyu beef and the champagne. "How are we affording this luxury catering company, Kendrick?" The entire kitchen went dead silent. The relatives stopped chewing. Brenda lowered her champagne glass, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Kendrick took a step toward me, his chest puffed out, his face flushing with immediate defensive anger. He looked around at his family, making sure he had their full attention before he decided to annihilate me in front of them. "How are we affording this?" Kendrick repeated loudly, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "I am the regional sales director for a Fortune 500 company. I bring in the real money in this house. You just sit at home playing on your laptop in your pajamas with your little cybersecurity hobby." He took another step closer, towering over me while I gripped my walker. "My money provides for this family," he shouted, pointing a finger directly at my face. "My hard work puts this roof over your head and this food on the table. I am providing for my blood. You eat my food, you live in my house, you spend my money, and you keep your mouth shut. Do not ever question me in front of my family again." The relatives erupted into a chorus of agreements and supportive murmurs. Brenda nodded vigorously, raising her glass to her son. "That is right," Brenda said loudly. "You tell her, Kendrick. A wife needs to know her place and be grateful for a husband who provides. She is just jealous because she is useless right now." I looked at Kendrick, staring directly into his arrogant, lying eyes. He was standing in a house I bought entirely with my own corporate tech money, claiming he provided it. He was serving food paid for by my stolen medical funds, claiming his regional sales director's salary covered it. A salary he no longer even had because he had been fired for embezzlement 3 weeks ago. The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost hypnotic. He had built an entire reality out of my resources and convinced himself he was the king of the castle. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my career. I simply lowered my eyes, acting the part of the defeated, humiliated wife. "Good boy," I thought to myself. "Keep digging your grave deeper in front of all these witnesses." The tension in the room was suddenly broken by a loud, obnoxious whistle. Trent pushed his way to the front of the crowd, holding a plate piled dangerously high with Wagyu beef and crab claws. He had changed out of his muddy clothes, but still carried that same insufferable arrogance. "Leave her alone." Kendrick Trent laughed, speaking around a mouthful of expensive meat. "You cannot expect someone with a little freelance gig to understand how real business works. She is just stressed because she knows she is a financial burden right now." The family immediately pivoted their attention to Trent, fawning over him like he was a visiting celebrity. Brenda practically shoved another bottle of champagne into his hands. "Trent is the one who is really carrying this family to wealth alongside my Kendrick," Brenda announced proudly to the room. "Tell them about your new application, Trent. Tell them about the investors." Trent puffed out his chest, swallowing his food and taking a large gulp of champagne. "Well," he started, acting falsely humble. "It is just a little health tech app I have been developing. It streamlines medical records using a proprietary algorithm I wrote myself. I have a huge meeting next week with a major venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. They are looking to drop an initial $5 million in seed funding to acquire my intellectual property. We are going to be filthy rich by Christmas." The aunts and uncles cheered, clapping loudly and reaching out to pat Trent on the back. Monique looked unbearably smug, leaning against her husband and glaring at me as if to prove she had married the superior provider. Trent looked down at me, leaning heavily on my walker, his eyes full of pity and disgust. "See, Justine," Trent said, using a condescending baby voice. "That is how you do real tech business. Maybe when you recover from your little backache, I can throw some data entry work your way. Give you some extra pocket money for your freelance gig. You know, keep you busy so you stop bothering Kendrick." I stared at Trent, my mind processing the sheer volume of his stupidity. He was bragging about a health tech app and a proprietary algorithm, an algorithm he claimed to have written himself, an algorithm that was about to secure $5 million in venture capital. I knew exactly what Trent was capable of, and writing complex medical privacy code was absolutely not in his skill set. He was a guy who barely knew how to troubleshoot his own home router. I did not say a word to Trent. I did not react to the insults from Brenda or the aggressive posturing from Kendrick. I just kept my head down slowly, turning my walker around. The agonizing friction in my lower back was screaming at me to lay down, but I had a much more urgent task to complete. I dragged my walker back down the hallway, the sounds of the family celebrating their imaginary wealth ringing in my ears. They were feasting on stolen food in a stolen house, bragging about stolen valor. They were so consumed by their own greed and ego that they did not even realize they were standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. I pushed the heavy wooden door of my office closed and locked it. The room was still dim, the computer monitors sleeping silently on my large desk. I ignored the deflated air mattress on the floor and slowly, painfully made my way to my ergonomic office chair. I gripped the armrests and lowered myself down, gritting my teeth as the metal brace dug into my surgical wound. I needed to formally check the financial routing because my physical therapist was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning for my first post-op home session. They required a direct payment transfer before the appointment could be confirmed. I opened my top desk drawer and pulled out my secure iPad. My hands were steady now, the adrenaline completely overriding the physical pain. I unlocked the device using my biometric scan and opened the secure banking application connecting directly to my medical trust account. The screen loaded, displaying the same horrific truth I had seen on my phone in the middle of the night. The balance was zero. But now, sitting at my secure terminal, I had access to the full transaction metadata. I tapped into the transfer history, pulling up the detailed digital receipt for the $150,000 withdrawal. I scanned the document, my eyes tracing the routing numbers, the timestamps, and the authorization protocols. The transfer had been approved using a direct digital signature. I clicked to view the signature file. There on the screen was a perfect pixel-by-pixel replication of my unique digital authorization key. Someone had completely bypassed the two-factor authentication by using a cloned version of my secure identity token. It was a forged digital signature. A highly sophisticated federal wire fraud crime executed directly from an IP address located inside this very house. Someone had transferred $150,000 out of my account and routed it to a dummy holding company. I sat in the quiet glow of the iPad screen, listening to the distant sounds of Kendrick and Trent laughing and drinking champagne in my kitchen. They thought I was just a freelance gig worker crying in the dark. They had no idea they had just stolen from a woman who built the cybersecurity architectures for international banks. The trap had not just been set, it had been armed, and I was about to burn their entire world to the ground. The thick, suffocating smell of roasted meat and spilled champagne lingered heavily in the stale air of my locked home office. I sat perfectly rigid in my ergonomic desk chair, my eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my iPad. The digital receipt confirming the theft of my $150,000 medical fund burned a permanent image into my mind. Beyond the heavy wooden door, the chaotic sounds of my husband's family finally began to subside. The loud booming laughter and the obnoxious thumping of the bass from the living room stereo slowly faded into a chorus of drunken, slurred conversations. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. The physical agony, radiating from the fresh titanium screws in my fused spine, was attempting to pull me into a state of unconsciousness, but I refused to surrender to the pain. My hospital gown was damp with cold sweat and the weeping fluid from my incision, but the woman who had been crying on the deflated air mattress hours ago was completely dead. In her place, a cold, calculating apex predator had taken the wheel. I waited in the dark, counting the minutes, as the invaders upstairs claimed the various bedrooms of my $3 million estate. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps, the slamming of custom oak doors, and the distant sound of someone vomiting in the downstairs powder room. They were entirely intoxicated, gorged on luxury seafood and premium alcohol paid for by the very money intended to keep me from becoming paralyzed. Eventually, the house settled into a profound silence, broken only by the deep rattling snores of an uncle passed out on my ruined velvet sofa. The digital clock on my monitor shifted to 3:15 in the morning. It was time to work. My hands were no longer shaking. The adrenaline flooding my system acted as a perfect temporary anesthetic. Kendrick had stood in my kitchen hours ago and mocked my career, calling it a little cybersecurity freelance gig. His staggering ignorance was his fatal flaw. He did not understand that as the founder and chief executive officer of an elite digital security firm, the entire technological infrastructure of this house was hardwired through my proprietary enterprise-grade servers. I built the network architecture they were all currently sleeping under. Every single device connected to my Wi-Fi was entirely visible and vulnerable to me. I booted up my primary desktop terminal, the soft mechanical hum of the cooling fans offering a comforting familiarity in the dark room. I bypassed my own front-end security protocols with a few rapid keystrokes, dropping directly into the administrative back-end of the local network. I initiated a silent packet sniffing diagnostic routing the data stream through a hidden encrypted tunnel so no alarms would trigger on the user end. Within seconds, a sprawling map of connected devices populated my screen. I immediately isolated Kendrick's personal laptop and his primary smartphone. Kendrick was an arrogant man who relied on cheap charm rather than actual intelligence. He used the exact same weak, unsecured password for every single device and account he owned. It took me precisely 4 minutes to bypass his rudimentary firewall crack, his local administration restrictions, and establish a silent, mirrored connection to his solid-state drive. I was not just looking at a screen share of his laptop, I was virtually inside the machine pulling every single byte of data directly onto my secure local server for analysis. I started by cracking open his email client searching for the digital trail of the wire transfer, but the very first thing that populated his primary inbox made my hands pause over the keyboard. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I was looking at his corporate email account, the account belonging to the Fortune 500 company where he loudly claimed to be the regional sales director. The most recent email was not a quarterly sales report or a regional client brief. It was a highly confidential communication from the corporate human resources and legal departments dated exactly 3 weeks ago. I ran a decryption script on the attached document and opened the PDF file. The header of the document was stamped in bold block letters reading, "Notice of immediate termination for cause." Kendrick had not taken time off work to host a massive family reunion. He had been fired. He had been completely stripped of his title, his income, and his corporate access 3 weeks ago. I read through the dense legal jargon detailing the exact nature of his dismissal, and a dark, humorless smile spread across my face. He had not just been underperforming in his region. The internal corporate audit team had caught him actively embezzling company funds. He had been running a pathetic, unsophisticated scheme involving falsified expense reports and fake vendor invoices siphoning thousands of corporate dollars into an offshore account to fund his lavish lifestyle. The company had fired him on the spot and given him a strict 30-day window to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a full repayment contract, or they were going to hand the entire investigative dossier over to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. I leaned back in my chair, the glowing monitors illuminating the absolute coldness in my eyes. The sheer magnitude of his narcissistic delusion was almost a work of art in its pathology. He had lost his job, his income, and his entire professional reputation because he was a common thief. Instead of coming to me, his wife, to confess his colossal failure and beg for financial assistance, he had doubled down on his arrogant provider persona. He had invited 21 members of his toxic, judgmental family to fly across the country to celebrate his imaginary success. He was putting on a grand theatrical performance of immense wealth and dominance, specifically to stroke his own fragile ego and hide his absolute ruin. And because he was completely broke and facing a massive corporate repayment demand, he needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to fund the illusion. I pivoted my search parameters, diving aggressively into his deleted system folders and his encrypted browser history. I needed to find the exact mechanism of his theft against me. I found the digital footprints buried in a hidden directory he had foolishly disguised as a generic system audio update file. Kendrick had rummaged through my old storage boxes in the basement while I was hospitalized and found an outdated physical backup drive. He had extracted an old but still viable digital authorization token I used for legacy banking systems. He spent the 3 days while I was in the hospital, having my spine cut open, coordinating with a dark web proxy service to clone the token. He then attached that cloned digital signature to a dummy limited liability company he had registered under a fake name in the state of Delaware. I tracked the routing numbers mapping the exact chronological flow of my $150,000. The moment the funds hit the dummy account, he started bleeding it dry to fund his fragile king of the castle fantasy. I pulled up the digital receipts he had carelessly left sitting in his downloads folder. $35,000 wired to the luxury catering company that was currently stinking up my kitchen with rotting crab legs. $8,000 spent on a fleet of black sports utility vehicles and limousines to pick his family up from the airport so they would think he was an important executive. $12,000 blown on designer watches, custom jewelry, and expensive handbags that I had seen Brenda and Monique flaunting in the living room earlier today. He was literally buying their love, their respect, and their submission using the blood money meant for my physical recovery and survival. He had drained my entire medical safety net to buy a few weeks of cheap applause from a family that would discard him the absolute second they realized he was broke. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness for the man I had married. I felt only the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner preparing the drop. I created a heavily encrypted master file on my local secure server. I copied the corporate termination letter, the undeniable evidence of his corporate embezzlement, the routing numbers for the dummy company, the cloned digital token code, and every single luxury receipt he had generated in the last 48 hours. I packaged it all into an immaculate, legally devastating dossier of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would not even have to do any real detective work. They would just have to read the file, print the warrant, and put the steel handcuffs on his wrists. I secured the master dossier, locking it behind 3 redundant layers of biometric encryption and a dead man's switch. My breathing was steady, and my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I had everything I needed to utterly destroy Kendrick and send him to federal prison for a very long time. I was just about to shut down the network mirroring program and attempt to lower myself back onto the deflated air mattress to get a few hours of sleep when a strange anomaly flashing on my secondary network monitor caught my eye. I leaned closer to the screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. The pain in my back was momentarily forgotten as my professional instincts took over. My automated intrusion detection system, which monitored the flow of all data entering and exiting the house, was flagging a massive sustained outbound data transfer. Someone in the house was currently wide awake and uploading a colossal amount of heavily encrypted data to an external offshore cloud server. This was not a simple movie download or a background phone backup. The packet size and the encryption protocols indicated a highly structured, dense data migration. I ran a rapid diagnostic trace on the local internal IP address that was initiating the massive upload. The device name popped up on my screen in plain text. It read, Trent MacBook Pro. I stared at the name, the arrogant white brother-in-law who had rested his muddy boots on my custom chair and mocked my career. Trent, the supposed brilliant tech entrepreneur who had claimed earlier that evening to have written a proprietary health tech algorithm entirely by himself. An algorithm he was using to secure $5 million in venture capital funding next week. I watched the data packets flowing out of his laptop through my network and a sudden terrifying realization washed over me. Trent did not know how to code, but he was currently sitting in my guest room, connected to my home network, uploading a massive proprietary source code package. And the only place in this entire house where a health tech algorithm of that magnitude could possibly exist was inside the secure partitions of my own company servers. I quickly opened a terminal window and intercepted the outbound data stream, copying a small sample of the encrypted packets to my local machine. I ran a decryption key against the sample, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The code unraveled on my screen, revealing lines of highly specialized syntax and unique variable structures. I recognized the code instantly. It was the core biometric sorting algorithm for Aegis Health Security, the multi-million-dollar enterprise where I served as the chief executive officer. It was the exact intellectual property that my engineering team had spent the last 2 years developing under strict non-disclosure agreements. Trent had not just insulted me in my living room. He had used his invitation into my home to actively infiltrate my professional life. He had waited until I was paralyzed in a hospital bed recovering from major spine surgery to connect his machine to my network, and slowly systematically siphon the lifeblood of my corporation to pass off as his own invention to Silicon Valley investors. The audacity of the theft was staggering. My husband had stolen my personal health funds to buy fake love, and his brother-in-law was currently stealing my corporate assets to buy fake success. They were a family of parasites feeding off my pain and my brilliance. I closed the terminal window and watched the upload progress bar on my monitor, a dangerous silent laugh vibrating in my chest. They truly believed they had conquered the fragile princess, but they had actually just locked themselves inside a cage with a monster. I watched the progress bar inch forward on my secondary monitor, a digital representation of my life's work, being siphoned away by a man who could not even wipe the mud off his own boots. The cold reality of Trent's theft settled over me, not with panic, but with a terrifying stillness. Aegis Health Security was not just a freelance gig. It was a multi-million-dollar enterprise that handled highly sensitive biometric data, sorting for major hospital networks across the globe. The algorithm Trent was currently uploading to an offshore cloud server was the crown jewel of my engineering team. It was proprietary, encrypted, and heavily guarded intellectual property. It was an advanced predictive diagnostic engine designed to monitor cardiac rhythms and catch fatal anomalies before they happened. My team had spent 2 grueling years writing and refining that code. So how did a man with the technical prowess of an arrogant toddler bypass enterprise-grade security on a direct local network? I needed to know exactly how he breached the vault. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the burning agony in my spine fading into white noise as I dropped deeper into the network logs. I ran a reverse diagnostic on the server access history, cross-referencing the physical media access control addresses of every device that had pinged the local hardware over the past month. The digital timeline materialized on my screen, painting a picture of opportunistic treason that made my blood run ice cold. The initial breach had not happened tonight. The unauthorized server access had happened exactly 4 days ago. 4 days ago, I was lying face down on an operating table under heavy anesthesia while a team of neurosurgeons drilled titanium screws into my lower vertebrae to fuse my spine. While I was bleeding and fighting for my future mobility, Trent had let himself into my home office. I pulled up the physical access logs for the hardware firewall. He had not hacked the system remotely using some brilliant cyber attack. He had physically plugged an external storage drive directly into my primary server rack. To do that, he needed the master override key, a physical encrypted token that I kept locked inside a biometric safe hidden in my desk drawer. But the safe had a manual failsafe override key, a small piece of metal I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my nightstand in the master bedroom. Kendrick, my husband, had to have given it to him. My own husband, the man who was currently parading around my kitchen pretending to be a wealthy executive, had handed the physical keys to my corporate kingdom over to his arrogant brother-in-law. Kendrick probably did it just to show off or to impress Trent with his access to my office, or maybe out of sheer ignorant spite. He had handed over access to a $50 million proprietary algorithm because he simply did not respect me or my career enough to understand what he was giving away. I intercepted the rest of the data packets Trent was actively uploading and began to dissect the payload while it was in transit. It was not just the raw source code he was stealing. He had included a beautifully formatted digital pitch deck intended for a massive venture capital firm located in Silicon Valley. I opened the presentation files and read through his absolute delusions of grandeur. Trent had slapped his own generic, terribly designed logo directly over the Aegis Health Security corporate watermark. He had copied my engineering team's complex white papers word for word, simply replacing my name with his own, claiming to be the lead architect and visionary founder of the technology. He was actively asking for $5 million in initial seed funding, valuing the stolen algorithm at over $50 million. He was planning to sell a stolen medical tracking system to investors who had no idea they were buying stolen property from a complete fraud. The sheer audacity of his actions made me sick to my stomach, but the digital trail he was leaving behind was a federal prosecutor's absolute dream scenario. Trent was using his personal, unencrypted laptop, connecting through my personal tracked Wi-Fi network, to upload stolen corporate assets to an external server, while simultaneously emailing the stolen documents to venture capitalists from his primary personal email address. He was leaving a digital fingerprint so massive and undeniable it could be seen from space. He thought because I was a woman recovering from spine surgery that I would never look at the server logs. He underestimated my intelligence, just like the rest of his family. I did not stop the upload. Stopping it would only alert his machine that the network administrator had caught him in the act. Instead, I let him finish routing the data while I quietly duplicated every single byte of evidence into a secure, localized legal vault. I captured the exact timestamps of his physical intrusion, mirroring them against the certified hospital records that proved I was incapacitated on an operating table under general anesthesia at the exact moment of the initial theft. I pulled the hardware address of his laptop, the internet protocol logs, the email headers, and the corrupted pitch deck. I gathered the metadata from his communications with the venture capital firm, verifying the exact names and corporate contact information of the investors he was trying to actively defraud across state lines. I compiled all of this data into a pristine, irrefutable chain of evidence. Then I went one step further. I remotely accessed the offshore cloud server he was uploading to and embedded invisible tracking pixels directly into the source code files he had just stolen. The moment he or his investors tried to compile or run the algorithm, the code would silently ping my corporate servers with their exact geographic location and hardware identifiers, proving possession of stolen digital goods. I locked the entire evidence package behind a military-grade encryption wall, tying it directly to the legal retainer account of my corporate attorneys. Trent was no longer just an annoying relative with muddy boots disrespecting my furniture. He was a corporate spy committing multi-million-dollar intellectual property theft and federal espionage. The sky outside my small office window began to shift from pitch black to a bruised purple. Dawn was breaking over the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. I had been sitting rigidly in my ergonomic chair for over 4 hours. The adrenaline that had fueled my silent digital execution was beginning to wane, and the physical reality of my shattered spine came rushing back with a terrifying vengeance. My lower back felt like it was submerged in boiling oil. The custom medical brace dug mercilessly into my bruised ribs, and the surgical dressing beneath my hospital gown was soaked completely through with warm weeping fluid. My legs trembled involuntarily as I slowly pushed myself away from the glowing monitors. I needed to lie down on the deflated camping mattress before my legs gave out completely, but my work was finally done. The traps were set, and the explosives were wired. My husband was facing federal wire fraud for stealing my medical funds, and his golden boy brother-in-law was facing a $10 million corporate espionage lawsuit for stealing my software. I had completely dismantled their entire futures from a dark room while they slept off their expensive stolen liquor. I grabbed the metal frame of my walker, my knuckles turning white as I prepared to lower my broken body to the floor. Heavy footsteps suddenly thundered down the hallway outside my office. The house was waking up and the invaders were resuming their hostile takeover. I heard Brenda's shrill voice demanding fresh coffee and complaining loudly about the temperature of the air conditioning. Then I heard Kendrick's heavy boots stomping purposefully directly toward my closed door. I did not even have time to turn my walker around to face the entrance. The heavy wooden door of my office did not just open. It was violently kicked inward, the brass knob slamming against the drywall with a deafening crack that shook the entire room. Kendrick stood in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot and his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He had slept off the expensive champagne, but his arrogant delusion remained firmly intact. He was wearing a fresh designer shirt paid for by my stolen medical fund, and he looked at me like I was a diseased insect that had crawled across his pristine floor. He did not care that I was gasping from the sudden violent noise, or that I was leaning heavily on a metal walker just to stay upright and keep my spine from collapsing. He marched into my sanctuary, invading the very last safe space I had left in my own home. He held a thick stack of legal papers in his right hand. He did not speak a single word of greeting. He did not ask about the fresh blood seeping visibly through my bandages. He simply raised his arm and threw the heavy stack of documents directly at my chest. The papers hit my hard medical brace with a loud slap and scattered across my desk and the hardwood floor. I looked down at the top page resting near my keyboard. The bold black letters spelled out a petition for dissolution of marriage. It was a divorce decree. I scanned the visible paragraphs, my mind reading the legal jargon with chilling clarity. He was formally demanding sole possession of the $3 million estate we were standing in. He was demanding ownership of my vehicles. And he had included a blatantly forged waiver of spousal support, claiming I had willingly agreed to walk away from the marriage with absolutely nothing to my name. He had actually spent the morning printing out a fraudulent legal document to bully a woman he thought was completely broken and financially ruined. I slowly raised my eyes to meet his. My face was devoid of any emotion. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stared at the man who had finalized his own destruction. "My family is right." Kendrick spat out, his voice dripping with venom and misplaced authority. "You are dead weight. You sit in here feeling sorry for yourself while I carry the burden of providing for everyone. I am done dragging you along. Sign this, leave the house to me, and I won't ask you for alimony." I stared at the fraudulent legal document resting against my keyboard. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, heavy breathing of the man standing over me. Kendrick was waiting for an explosion. He was bracing himself for a screaming match, anticipating that I would fight back, defend my property, and demand explanations. He wanted a war because fighting him would validate his delusion that we were equals battling over shared assets. But a war right now would be premature. If I challenged him, he might panic. He might check his bank accounts. He might tell Trent to double-check the network security. I needed them completely blind, deaf, and drunk on their own arrogance for the next few hours. To destroy a narcissist, you do not fight their ego, you feed it until it bursts. I let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally slouching against the rigid plastic of my medical brace. The sudden movement sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain directly into my fresh surgical wound, forcing a completely genuine gasp from my lips. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes immediately. I did not have to fake the physical agony, but I absolutely weaponized it for my performance. I let my hands begin to tremble violently, gripping the metal frame of my walker until my knuckles turned stark white. I forced my breathing to become rapid and shallow, mimicking the onset of a severe panic attack. "Kendrick!" I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly, pitching the tone to sound like a terrified, broken woman. Please do not do this. You cannot mean this. I watched his chest puff out, the rigid defensive posture melting into a stance of absolute supreme dominance. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into a cruel, satisfied smirk. He was literally feeding off my simulated despair. "Sign the papers, Justine!" he demanded, his voice booming with fake authority. "You have been nothing but an anchor dragging me down." I am finally cutting the cord. I let my legs buckle slightly, sinking down to my knees on the deflated air mattress. The pain was blinding, but I embraced it, using the physical torture to push heavy, genuine tears down my cheeks. I looked up at him through wet eyelashes, making myself look as small and pathetic as humanly possible. "Please, Kendrick," I sobbed loudly, letting the desperation bleed into every single syllable. "I have nothing without you. I am injured. I cannot walk. I cannot work my little freelance jobs right now. Where am I supposed to go? You are my husband. You promised to take care of me. Please do not throw me out on the street." It was the most degrading, humiliating performance of my entire life, but it worked flawlessly. Kendrick's eyes widened with absolute glee. He was practically vibrating with excitement. This was exactly the narrative he had sold to his family, that he was the sole provider, the powerful executive carrying a useless dependent wife. My groveling was validating every single lie he had told them. It was so intoxicating to him that he could not keep it to himself. He needed an audience for his grand victory. "Mom," Kendrick shouted, turning his head toward the open doorway. "Brenda, get in here! You have to see this!" Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. Brenda's imposing figure appeared in the doorway, followed closely by Monique and Trent. They crowded into the small home office, their faces flushed from the expensive champagne they had been drinking all morning. They looked down at me, kneeling on the cheap plastic air mattress, wearing a stained hospital gown, crying uncontrollably over a stack of fake divorce papers. "Look at her," Kendrick laughed, pointing down at me like I was a pathetic exhibit in a museum. "I finally gave her the divorce papers and told her she is leaving empty-handed. Now she is begging me to let her stay because she knows she cannot survive without my money." Brenda let out a sharp, vicious cackle that echoed off the walls. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I told you from the very beginning that she was a gold digger," Brenda announced to the room. "She trapped you because she knew you were going to be a wealthy executive. Now that she is broken and useless, she expects you to just keep paying for her existence." I turned my tear-stained face toward Brenda, reaching out one trembling hand toward her. "Please, Brenda," I cried out, my voice shaking with manufactured terror. "Talk to him. You are a mother. You understand what it means to care for family. I am recovering from major spine surgery. I cannot even stand up by myself. Please tell him to give me another chance. I will be better. I will do whatever he wants." My internal monologue was screaming with dark amusement. I was laying the traps so thick and heavy I was amazed they could not see the wires, but their arrogance blinded them completely. Brenda actually stepped forward and kicked the metal leg of my walker away from me. It clattered against the desk, making me flinch. "Do not you dare appeal to me, you pathetic little girl!" Brenda spat out, her face twisting with disgust. "You have been nothing but disrespectful to me and my family since the moment we arrived. You hid your pain medication. You refused to cook. You laid around complaining while my son spent thousands of dollars treating us to luxury. You do not deserve him. Sign the papers and get out of my son's house." Monique pushed past her mother, pulling her smartphone out of her pocket. She held it up, aiming the camera lens directly at my face. The bright flash illuminated the dark office, temporarily blinding me. She snapped photo after photo of me kneeling on the floor, crying in my bulky medical brace. "Oh, this is going straight on social media," Monique laughed, her thumbs flying across the screen as she typed out a caption. Finally taking out the trash. Hashtag upgrading, hashtag rich brother, hashtag dead weight. She shoved the phone screen into Trent's face, showing off her cruel handiwork. "Look at her face, Trent. She looks like a drowned rat." Trent leaned against the doorframe, picking his teeth with a toothpick, his eyes raking over my trembling form. He shook his head, letting out a slow, condescending sigh. "It is actually embarrassing to watch," Trent said, crossing his arms. "You are a worthless leech, Justine. You seriously thought you could ride his coattails forever, playing on your little computer, pretending to be important while he brings in the real cash. Kendrick is about to be flying high, and my app is about to make us multi-millionaires. We do not have room for dead weight dragging down the family empire. You should just sign the papers and go quietly before you embarrass yourself any further." I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders shake with fake sobs. I covered my face with my hands, listening to them tear me apart piece by piece. Every single insult, every mocking laugh, every photo they took was just more fuel for the absolute inferno I was about to unleash upon them. They were digging their own graves, and they were having the time of their lives doing it. "All right, that is enough," Kendrick said, clapping his hands together. "Let her sit here and cry about it. She has until tomorrow to sign the papers and pack whatever garbage she brought into this marriage. We have better things to do than watch her whine." "Where are we going, bro?" Trent asked eagerly, tossing his toothpick onto my hardwood floor. "We are taking the champagne out to the pool," Kendrick announced, his voice booming with fake magnanimity. "We are celebrating my freedom and the future of this family. The catering company left plenty of Wagyu, and I am not letting it go to waste while we sit in this depressing little room." The family cheered loudly, Brenda clapping her hands and Monique already turning back toward the kitchen to grab more alcohol. They filed out of the office, their voices carrying down the hallway, as they discussed exactly how they were going to redecorate the house once I was permanently evicted. Brenda loudly declared she wanted the living room painted an obnoxious shade of yellow. Kendrick was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway looking down at me one final time. He did not look like a man who had just ended a marriage. He looked like a tyrant who had just executed a peasant. "Clean yourself up, Justine," he ordered coldly. "You are making a mess of my floor." He reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door and pulled it shut. The latch clicked into place with a loud finality. The sound of their footsteps retreated down the hallway, heading toward the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard pool patio. I waited, listening to the distant slide of the glass door, opening and closing, cutting off the loud outdoor celebration from the interior of the house. I stayed on my knees for exactly 30 seconds, ensuring no one was coming back for a second round of humiliation. The silence in the house stretched out thick and absolute. The moment I was certain I was completely alone, the violent trembling in my shoulders stopped instantly. I lowered my hands from my face. There were tear tracks on my cheeks, but my eyes were completely dry. The expression of terrified desperation vanished from my features, wiped clean like chalk from a board. My face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated stone. I placed my hands flat against the cold hardwood floor and engaged my core, carefully isolating my back muscles to protect the spinal fusion. I pushed myself up, reaching out to grab the edge of my heavy wooden desk. The physical pain was still a roaring inferno in my lower back, but it was entirely manageable now. The psychological relief of shedding the victim persona gave me a surge of pure crystalline adrenaline. I hauled myself up into my ergonomic office chair, the metal brace settling into the padded backing. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks, using the back of my hospital gown. My breathing was slow, steady, and completely controlled. They had bought the performance perfectly. They were outside drinking stolen champagne, celebrating an imaginary fortune, completely unaware that the guillotine blade was already falling toward their necks. I reached out and dragged my keyboard toward me. The multiple monitors glowing in the dim light of the office illuminated the cold, dead focus in my eyes. I minimized the diagnostic window that was still quietly mirroring Trent's stolen data upload. I opened a new highly secured browser window, routing my connection through an encrypted offshore virtual private network to ensure maximum anonymity and security. I typed in the web address for a specialized encrypted email portal. It was a secure communication channel I used exclusively for high-level corporate emergencies and direct contact with my personal legal defense team. The login screen prompted me for a multi-factor authentication sequence. I entered my biometric scan input, a complex alphanumeric passphrase, and verified the connection using a secure physical token attached to my primary server rack. The portal loaded instantly, displaying a sterile minimalist interface designed for pure functionality. There were no advertisements, no colorful graphics, just a blank canvas waiting for instructions. I opened 3 new composition windows, aligning them side by side across my massive ultra-wide monitor. I had played the pathetic broken wife exactly as they wanted. I had fed their egos until they were completely bloated and blind to their surroundings. They thought they had isolated me, stripped me of my resources, and backed me into a corner where I had no choice but to surrender. They had no idea that backing a predator into a corner is the most dangerous mistake prey can ever make. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp and distinct in the quiet room. My eyes scanned the blank composition windows, reviewing the exact sequence of destruction I was about to set into motion. The tactical setup was complete. The enemy had abandoned their defensive positions to celebrate prematurely. It was time to lock the doors, burn the bridges, and detonate the charges. I dragged my cursor over to the first blank composition window on my left monitor. This email was going to my primary corporate attorney, Marcus Vance, a man whose legal ruthlessness was matched only by his absolute loyalty to my company. I began typing my keystrokes steady and deliberate in the quiet room. Marcus, I wrote, I am initiating an emergency protocol Alpha. My husband Kendrick has committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny. He used a cloned digital authorization token to bypass my secure banking portal and siphon $150,000 from my dedicated medical recovery fund. I have packaged the digital receipts, the routing numbers, the IP address logs, and the exact timestamps of the theft into the attached encrypted dossier. I need you to immediately file a formal report with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrime Division. Furthermore, I need an immediate and total asset freeze on all joint accounts and a hard lock on my personal finances. I paused to let the pain in my spine settle before continuing the message to Marcus. Kendrick threw a fake divorce petition at me tonight, claiming he will take this house. Please, prepare the counter filings immediately. As you are fully aware, he has absolutely no legal standing to claim a single square inch of this property. I smiled a cold, bitter smile as I typed those words. Kendrick was so financially illiterate that he never actually understood the paperwork he signed before our wedding. This $3 million mansion was not marital property. It had never been marital property. I had purchased this entire estate through a private, irrevocable trust, completely shielding it from any future marital claims. The trust was established long before I ever met Kendrick, and he had zero equity, zero ownership, and zero rights to the property. He was legally nothing more than a temporary guest living in an estate owned by my corporate entity. I instructed Marcus to draft an immediate eviction notice and a formal trespassing warning for Kendrick and the 21 relatives currently occupying my trust-owned property. I attached the master evidence file and hit send, watching the first missile launch into the digital night. I moved my cursor to the middle screen, opening the second composition window. This one required a different kind of precision. Trent thought he was a brilliant tech entrepreneur, but he had left the digital equivalent of a glowing neon sign pointing directly to his venture capital investors in Silicon Valley. I had pulled the contact information of the senior partners at Apex Global Ventures directly from Trent's stolen email outbox. I addressed the email to the managing partners, outlining the reality of their pending $5 million seed investment. To the partners of Apex Global Ventures, I typed, my eyes scanning the stolen pitch deck Trent had sent them. It has come to my attention that you are currently in late-stage funding negotiations with an individual named Trent regarding a proprietary health tech diagnostic algorithm. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Health Security. The algorithm currently in Trent's possession is our stolen intellectual property. It was illegally extracted from our secure corporate servers via a physical hardware breach within the last 96 hours. I am attaching a formal cease and desist order generated by my corporate legal team. Furthermore, I have attached the embedded metadata, the source code origin timestamps, and the access logs, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Trent is attempting to sell you stolen corporate assets. If your firm proceeds with any financial backing or attempts to compile the stolen code, we will name Apex Global Ventures as co-conspirators in a $10 million federal corporate espionage lawsuit. I strongly advise you to terminate all contact with this individual immediately. I attached the damning evidence package, ensuring the legal threat was heavily documented. Trent had built his entire arrogant persona on the illusion of his impending wealth. He had looked down on me and insulted my career while actively trying to pawn off my engineering team's blood, sweat, and tears as his own genius. By the time the venture capital partners opened their email in the morning, Trent's entire future would evaporate. His funding would be permanently pulled, his reputation in the tech industry would be obliterated, and he would be staring down the barrel of a massive federal lawsuit that would bankrupt him for the rest of his natural life. I clicked send on the second email, sealing Trent's fate with a single keystroke. My back was screaming in protest, the muscles seizing in violent spasms, but I only had one window left. I moved my mouse to the third screen. This email was purely tactical, designed to publicly humiliate Kendrick in front of the very people he was trying so desperately to impress. He had hired an elite luxury catering service and a premium black car limousine company to shuttle his family around Atlanta, playing the role of the big shot executive. He had authorized the payments using the medical funds he stole from me, routed through the dummy account he set up on the dark web. I had already contacted my bank through the secure portal and reported the fraudulent transfers, initiating a federal clawback of the stolen funds. The dummy account Kendrick created was now completely frozen, and the transactions were marked as active wire fraud. This meant the credit card authorizations he gave to the vendors were about to bounce hard. I drafted an urgent message to the billing departments of both the catering company and the limousine service. I informed them that the individual who had booked their services under Kendrick's name had done so using stolen funds related to an active federal cybercrime investigation. I advised them that all pending digital payments had been permanently canceled and frozen by federal banking authorities. If they wanted to be compensated for the Wagyu beef, the colossal seafood, the champagne, and the luxury transportation, they needed to collect payment in physical cash directly from Kendrick before he fled the premises. I hit send on the final email, leaning back into my chair and letting out a long, slow breath. The heavy lifting was done. The legal and financial traps were set in stone, wired tight, and completely unavoidable. My corporate lawyer was unleashing the FBI on my husband. The Silicon Valley investors were dropping Trent and preparing to sue him into oblivion. The local luxury vendors were about to realize they were being scammed by a broke, unemployed embezzler, and they would be coming to collect their money by any means necessary. And underneath it all lay the beautiful, undeniable reality that none of them had any legal right to be standing inside my home. They were trespassers sitting on a ticking time bomb. The long, agonizing hours of the night slowly ticked by as I sat perfectly still in the glow of my monitors. My body was a temple of pure physical torment, but my mind was completely at peace. I listened to the deep silence of the house, the invaders sleeping off their gluttonous feast, unaware that their lives were already effectively over. The sky outside my window slowly shifted from bruised purple to a hazy gray, and finally to a brilliant, bright Sunday morning. The house began to wake up around 8 in the morning. I could hear the heavy footsteps resuming their chaotic march across my hardwood floors. The toilets flushed, the showers ran, and the loud, obnoxious voices of Kendrick's family filled the air. They were buzzing with excitement, preparing for what Kendrick had loudly dubbed the Grand Cookout. It was supposed to be his ultimate crowning achievement, a massive backyard barbecue where he planned to invite local Atlanta socialites, neighborhood influencers, and wealthy business contacts to show off his beautiful estate and his successful family. He was planning to stand by my luxury outdoor kitchen, flipping expensive steaks and playing the king while I was locked in a dark office crying on an air mattress. I heard Brenda shouting orders from the kitchen, her shrill voice echoing down the hallway. She was demanding that Monique get the toddlers dressed in their best clothes because important people were coming over. I heard Trent laughing loudly, bragging to one of the uncles about how he was going to buy a new sports car by the end of the week once his venture capital money cleared. Their delusions were so profound it was almost comical. They were polishing the brass on the Titanic while the ship was already sitting on the ocean floor. I slowly pushed myself up from my desk chair, my legs trembling under the weight of my medical brace. The fluid from my surgical wound had completely soaked through my bandages, making my hospital gown stick uncomfortably to my lower back. The pain was blinding, causing black spots to dance at the edges of my vision, but I forced myself to stand tall. I gripped the handles of my metal walker, bracing myself for the final act of this miserable play. I slowly, carefully unlocked my office door and pushed it open an inch, letting the sounds of the house wash over me. Kendrick was pacing the hallway, barking into his cell phone. He was talking to a local party rental company, demanding to know where the extra outdoor seating and the premium sound system he ordered were. He was acting furious, playing the part of the demanding, wealthy client, angry that his grand cookout was not being prioritized. He had no idea that the credit card he used to book the rentals had just bounced into the stratosphere. The smell of expensive catering once again began to drift through the house as the morning wore on. Kendrick had apparently arranged for a morning delivery of premium brunch items before the main afternoon barbecue. He was bleeding the stolen medical fund dry, completely unaware that the account had already been locked down by federal fraud investigators. I stood in the shadow of my office doorway, watching the family scurry back and forth, carrying trays of food out to the patio, setting up the backyard for their magnificent high society debut. The clock on my wall ticked past 11 in the morning. The early arrivals for the grand cookout were expected soon. Kendrick was standing in the foyer wearing a pristine white linen outfit, adjusting his expensive watch and checking his reflection in my custom entryway mirror. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. A man who believed he had successfully conquered the world, crushed his wife, and secured his future through theft and deception. Brenda stood next to him, picking lint off his shoulder, telling him how proud she was of her wealthy, successful son. I tightened my grip on my walker, my knuckles stark white. I closed my eyes and listened carefully, tuning out the annoying chatter of my mother-in-law and the screeching of the toddlers playing in the formal dining room. I was listening for a very specific sound, a sound I knew was coming. At first, it was just a faint rumble in the distance, vibrating through the quiet Sunday morning air of my exclusive suburban neighborhood. Then the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the heavy, unmistakable growl of large diesel engines shifting gears as they turned onto my private street. The deep rumbling was accompanied by the aggressive screech of air brakes and the heavy crunch of large tires rolling forcefully onto the expensive brick pavers of my long driveway. Kendrick frowned, turning away from the mirror and looking toward the heavy oak front door. Brenda stopped talking, her head tilting in confusion. The sound of the diesel engines was suddenly joined by another noise, a sharp, piercing wail that cut through the peaceful morning atmosphere like a knife. It was the loud, aggressive burst of a police siren, followed immediately by the rhythmic, flashing reflection of red and blue lights bouncing off the sheer curtains in the living room. Kendrick froze, his hands dropping to his sides. The color rapidly drained from his face as the heavy vehicles slammed into park directly outside the front gate. The grand cookout was about to begin, but the guests arriving were not the wealthy Atlanta socialites Kendrick had invited to stroke his ego. The trap had finally snapped shut, and the bill had officially come due. The loud, aggressive knock at the front door was ignored by Kendrick, who was too busy staring out the back windows at his precious grand cookout. The backyard of my estate was already swarming with people. The early arrivals, the wealthy neighborhood socialites and local business contacts. Kendrick had desperately courted, were mingling on the stone patio, holding crystal glasses of champagne and platefuls of expensive seafood. The 21 members of his family were scattered across the manicured lawn, laughing loudly and completely dominating the outdoor seating areas. The rented sound system was blasting upbeat music, vibrating the glass of the sliding doors. Kendrick quickly shook off the panic from the sirens outside, convincing himself it was just a passing emergency vehicle on the main road. He adjusted his crisp white linen shirt, plastered a fake confident smile across his face, and stepped out onto the patio to play the role of the generous billionaire host. I remained hidden in the shadows of my home office, leaning heavily against the doorframe, gripping my metal walker. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. The sirens outside had not faded away down the street. They had stopped directly in front of my property. Through the sheer curtains of the front-facing windows, I watched as 3 massive commercial catering trucks and a fleet of black executive sport utility vehicles aggressively blockaded my long brick driveway. The vehicles were accompanied by 2 local police cruisers, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the bright Sunday morning sunlight. The vendors had not come alone. They had brought off-duty officers acting as private security, and they were not here to deliver more Wagyu beef. They were here to collect their money. I watched as a group of large, angry men in crisp professional uniforms marched past the front door, entirely bypassing the formal entryway. They knew the party was in the backyard. They walked with heavy, determined steps down the side path of the estate, pushing past the manicured hedges and heading directly for the wrought iron gates that opened onto the pool patio. The leader of the group was the owner of the luxury catering company, a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a thick stack of printed invoices. Right beside him was the owner of the limousine service, his face red with barely contained fury. They were flanked by 4 massive security guards, their hands resting intimidatingly on their tactical belts. I slowly turned my walker around the painful friction in my fused spine, screaming in protest, but I ignored it. I pushed myself down the hallway toward the kitchen, wanting a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of my husband's fragile ego. I positioned myself near the large sliding glass doors, hidden behind the silk drapes, watching the backyard perfectly. Kendrick was standing near the outdoor kitchen holding a pair of silver tongs, laughing loudly at a joke one of his wealthy invited guests had just made. Brenda was sitting on a plush outdoor sofa, bragging to a group of neighborhood wives about her son's imaginary corporate success. Monique and Trent were standing near the edge of the infinity pool holding plates of expensive food, looking down their noses at everyone around them. It was a picture-perfect scene of stolen luxury and fraudulent wealth. The wrought iron side gate suddenly burst open with a loud metallic clang that cut through the upbeat music. The catering manager and the limousine owner marched directly onto the patio, their heavy boots echoing on the stone pavers. The 4 security guards fanned out immediately, forming an intimidating blockade near the exits. The sudden aggressive intrusion caused a ripple of confusion to spread through the crowd of guests. Conversations abruptly stopped. People lowered their champagne glasses, turning to stare at the angry men storming through the party. Kendrick froze, his smile dropping instantly. He lowered the silver tongs, staring at the catering manager with wide, panicked eyes. He tried to quickly recover, stepping forward with his chest puffed out, attempting to maintain his dominant alpha male persona in front of his wealthy guests. "Excuse me," Kendrick said, his voice tight with false authority. "What is the meaning of this? You cannot just barge into my private event. This is a closed party." The catering manager did not even blink. He marched right up to Kendrick, invading his personal space, and shoved the thick stack of printed invoices directly into Kendrick's chest. "Cut the garbage, Mr. Rich Man," the catering manager barked, his voice booming across the patio, loud enough for every single guest and family member to hear perfectly. "Your credit cards just bounced into the stratosphere. My bank just notified me that the initial authorization you gave us was flagged by federal authorities as fraudulent wire activity. The bank locked the funds and reversed the charges. You are completely broke, and you are currently serving my premium Wagyu beef and my imported champagne to your friends on stolen credit." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy socialites. People physically took a step back from Kendrick, holding their plates of food like they had suddenly caught fire. Brenda dropped her crystal flute onto the patio where it shattered into a dozen pieces. The color drained from her face as she stared at her golden child son. Kendrick swallowed hard, sweat suddenly beading on his forehead. He looked around at the judging eyes of his neighbors, his facade cracking violently under the pressure. "Look, there has to be a mistake," he stammered, his voice losing all its previous boom. "My accounts are fine. There must be a bank error. I am a regional sales director. I have plenty of liquid assets. Just step inside with me and we can sort this out quietly." "We are not stepping anywhere quietly," the owner of the limousine service interrupted, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with the catering manager. "You booked a fleet of luxury SUVs for your family all weekend, claiming you were some high-rolling executive. My dispatch just got the same federal fraud alert. You used a cloned digital token to steal the money for the deposits. We are not leaving this property until we are paid in full. You owe us a combined total of $40,000 for the food, the alcohol, the staff, and the transportation. We want our $40,000 right now in cash, or a certified cashier's check, or my security team is going to start repossessing everything on this patio, including the watches off your family's wrists." The absolute humiliation was palpable. The silence in the backyard was deafening, broken only by the gentle splashing of the infinity pool. The wealthy neighbors, the local influencers, the people Kendrick had so desperately wanted to impress, were now staring at him with pure disgust. They were witnessing a pathetic broke fraud being publicly dismantled. Whispering started among the crowd. Guests began setting their plates down on the tables and quietly edging toward the front gates, wanting to distance themselves from the criminal spectacle. Brenda suddenly jumped up from the sofa, her maternal instinct to protect her son overriding her common sense. She marched up to the vendors, waving her finger aggressively in their faces. "How dare you come into my son's house and disrespect him like this?" Brenda shrieked. "My son is a wealthy man. He is a provider. You are just a bunch of low-class workers trying to scam us out of our money. Get off his property before we call the police." The catering manager let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Lady, the police are already parked at the end of your driveway. We brought them with us. They are waiting for our signal to come back here and arrest your son for grand larceny and wire fraud. So unless you have $40,000 hidden in that cheap knockoff purse of yours, I suggest you shut your mouth before you catch an accessory charge." Brenda's mouth snapped shut. She shrank back, looking at Kendrick with wide, terrified eyes. Trent tried to step forward, puffing his chest out to act tough, but one of the massive security guards simply shifted his weight and glared at him. Trent immediately backed down, shrinking behind Monique like a coward. The 21 relatives who had spent the last 2 days treating my home like a free luxury resort were suddenly realizing they were completely trapped in a nightmare. Their wealthy provider was a total fraud. Kendrick was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the patio, looking for any possible escape route. He was trapped. The vendors were not leaving, the security guards blocked the exits, and the police were waiting at the gate. The public humiliation was destroying him, breaking his mind in real time. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a savior. He needed money. His head snapped toward the house, his eyes locking onto the sliding glass doors. He saw me standing in the shadows, leaning on my walker. The panic in his eyes instantly morphed into a desperate, manic rage. He dropped the silver tongs clattering onto the stone pavers and stormed toward the house, pushing past his horrified relatives. He ripped the sliding glass door open, marching into the kitchen with his fists clenched. He stopped a few feet away from me, breathing heavily, his pristine white linen shirt now stained with nervous sweat. "You," Kendrick hissed, his voice shaking with a dangerous, desperate energy. "You did this. You called the bank. You locked the account." I looked at him, my face a mask of absolute calm stone. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I gripped the handles of my metal walker, staring directly into the eyes of a completely broken man. I simply reported a fraudulent transfer on my personal medical account. Kendrick, I said, my voice low and steady. I am not responsible for the fact that you decided to throw a luxury party using stolen funds you embezzled from your wife, recovering from spine surgery. Kendrick grabbed the edge of the kitchen island, his knuckles turning white. He was completely unhinged, his ego shattered into a million pieces. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, smelling of fear and expensive stolen scotch. "Listen to me very carefully," he ordered, his voice a panicked growl. "You are going to open your computer right now. You are going to unlock those funds, and you are going to wire $40,000 to those vendors outside. You are going to save my face in front of my family and my guests. If you do not do this right now, I swear to God, Justine, I will make your life a living hell. I will take this house. I will take everything you own. You owe me this. I am your husband." I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his demands wash over me. He was standing in the ashes of his own destruction, still trying to command the flames. He still thought he had power over me. He still thought I was the fragile princess crying on the air mattress. He had no idea that the $40,000 he owed the vendors was the absolute least of his problems. I did not argue with him. I did not scream or cry. I slowly, deliberately reached into the deep pocket of my hospital gown. My fingers closed around a thick, heavy manila folder I had compiled earlier that morning. The folder contained the printed corporate termination letter, the FBI wire fraud report, the cease and desist order for Trent, and the absolute unassailable legal proof that this $3 million estate belonged entirely to my private trust. I looked at Kendrick, a cold, terrifying smile finally breaking across my face. "You want me to save your face in front of your family, Kendrick?" I asked, my voice dripping with dark amusement. "Fine. Let us go talk to your family." I slowly turned my walker around, facing the open sliding glass doors leading to the patio. The pain in my spine was a dull, distant roar, completely muted by the massive surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. Every single eye in the backyard was fixed on the open doorway, waiting to see what the supposed wealthy executive was going to do to resolve his massive criminal debt. The vendors stood with their arms crossed. The security guards watched with silent intimidation, and the 21 relatives held their breath in collective terror. I pushed my walker forward, stepping out of the shadows of the kitchen and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the patio. The heavy plastic medical brace wrapped around my torso was clearly visible beneath my thin gown. I walked with agonizing slow precision, the metal legs of the walker scraping against the stone pavers. The crowd parted for me, instinctively stepping back from the sheer radiating intensity of my presence. I walked directly to the center of the patio, stopping right in front of the large outdoor dining table. Kendrick followed closely behind me, his face pale, sweating profusely, hoping against hope that I was about to play the role of the submissive, obedient wife, bailing him out of his mess. Brenda watched me with wide, fearful eyes, clutching her cheap purse to her chest. Trent stared at me, his arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. I stood perfectly still, balancing my weight on the walker. I looked at the catering manager, making direct eye contact with the man demanding $40,000. Then I slowly turned my head, sweeping my gaze across the 21 family members who had tortured me, disrespected my home, and treated me like trash for the last 48 hours. Finally, I looked at the wealthy socialites and neighbors who were watching the spectacle with morbid fascination. The silence on the patio was absolute. The music had been cut off. The wind seemed to stop blowing. Everyone was waiting for me to speak. Everyone was waiting for me to save the golden boy. I slowly raised my right hand, holding the thick, heavy manila folder up for everyone to see. The crisp, brown paper caught the sunlight. I held it suspended in the air for 5 long, agonizing seconds, letting the suspense build until it was suffocating. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I let the folder drop. It hit the center of the glass patio table with a loud, sharp slap that echoed across the backyard like a gunshot. The thick stack of papers inside slid out, fanning across the table, displaying bold black federal headers, corporate logos, and red legal stamps for everyone to see. The reckoning had officially arrived. The sharp crack of the thick manila folder hitting the glass patio table hung in the humid Georgia air like a judge striking a gavel. The crisp white pages fanned out across the smooth surface, displaying the stark black and white reality of Kendrick's absolute destruction. The bold red stamps of the federal wire fraud report caught the bright afternoon sunlight. The corporate termination letter, with its unmistakable letterhead, rested right in the center for everyone to see. For a moment, nobody moved. The 21 family members who had spent the last 2 days treating my home like their personal luxury resort were frozen in place, their plates of stolen Wagyu beef resting heavy in their hands. The wealthy neighborhood socialites who had come to network with the supposedly powerful executive stood in stunned silence, their champagne flutes lowered. The massive security guards and the angry vendors stared at the documents on the table, trying to process the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Kendrick was the first to react. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding his paralyzing terror. He lunged forward, his hands frantically scrambling across the glass table, trying to scoop up the damning papers and hide them from the judging eyes of his audience. "Do not touch those," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with absolute chilling clarity. I slammed the metal legs of my walker down onto the stone pavers, taking a deliberate step forward. The sheer authority radiating from my broken body made Kendrick freeze his hands, hovering inches above the documents. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes begging me to stop, begging me to maintain his fragile illusion for just one more minute. I did not look at my husband. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with the towering catering manager, who was still holding the stack of unpaid invoices. "I am not paying for the food of a man who stole $150,000 from his wife's spinal surgery fund." I said, my words ringing out across the quiet patio, crystal clear and utterly devoid of emotion. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. The relatives exchanged horrified glances. The wealthy neighbors began to whisper furiously to one another, stepping even further back toward the wrought iron gates. "She is lying!" Kendrick shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic. He spun around to face his guests, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Do not listen to her. She is completely out of her mind. She just had major back surgery and she is heavily medicated. The painkillers are making her hallucinate. She does not know what she is saying. I am a regional sales director. My accounts are just experiencing a temporary routing error." I let out a slow, dark laugh that silenced his frantic babbling immediately. The sound of my laughter was cold and sharp, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "There is no routing error, Kendrick," I said, staring a hole directly through his pathetic facade. "And the only hallucination happening here is the one you have been selling to your family for the last 3 weeks." I pointed a trembling finger at the papers scattered across the glass table. I addressed the crowd directly, projecting my voice so every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and neighbor could hear the absolute truth. "Read the top document," I instructed the catering manager. "Go ahead. Read it out loud for the generous host." The catering manager stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the stone. He looked down at the table, his eyes scanning the bold corporate letterhead. His eyebrows shot up in surprise as he absorbed the legal text. He did not pick up the paper, but he read the title loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Notice of immediate termination for cause." He read, his deep voice carrying over the silent crowd. "Effective 3 weeks ago. Terminated for gross financial misconduct and corporate embezzlement." The murmurs in the crowd erupted into loud gasps. Uncles who had been clapping Kendrick on the back just an hour ago now looked at him with profound disgust. The wealthy socialites were actively setting their glasses down and slipping out the front gate, completely abandoning the sinking ship. "He is not a regional sales director," I announced to the horrified audience. "He was fired 3 weeks ago for stealing from his own company. He is an unemployed, disgraced embezzler who is currently facing federal prosecution. He has no job, he has no income, and he has no liquid assets. Kendrick staggered backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. He bumped into the outdoor kitchen counter, his pristine white linen shirt now clinging to his sweating back. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another desperate lie, but I did not give him the chance to breathe. I pressed the attack, pinning him down with the absolute crushing weight of his own actions. When the corporate auditors caught him stealing, he needed a massive influx of cash to hide his ruin from all of you. I continued, gesturing toward the 21 family members who were now staring at Kendrick in total shock. So while I was lying unconscious on an operating table, having my spine fused together with titanium screws, your generous host stole a legacy security token from my basement. He cloned my digital signature and he bypassed the security on my private medical trust. He drained $150,000 out of the fund meant to pay for my physical therapy and my survival. I pointed a shaking finger directly at the towering seafood boils and the expensive champagne buckets. Every single piece of meat you have eaten this weekend, every drop of liquor you have swallowed, every luxury black car that picked you up from the airport was paid for. With the blood money he stole from my broken spine, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. You are celebrating his success, using the funds that were supposed to keep me from becoming paralyzed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has already frozen his dummy accounts, and the wire fraud charges have already been filed. He is not a provider. He is a parasite. The absolute devastation on the patio was a masterpiece to witness. The entire illusion of Kendrick's grand wealthy existence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His aunts and uncles looked physically sick, looking down at their plates of food in horror. They had spent 2 days mocking me, treating me like a lazy burden while gorging themselves on my stolen medical funds. The realization of what they had been participating in washed over them, leaving them completely speechless. But not Brenda. Brenda's delusion ran so deep, so fundamentally into her core identity, that she simply could not process the reality unfolding in front of her. To accept that her golden child son was a broke, unemployed thief meant accepting that her own status as the wealthy matriarch was a complete lie. Her brain violently rejected the truth. She snapped. Brenda pushed her way through the frozen relatives. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, irrational rage. She marched right up to the glass table, slapping her hand down hard next to the FBI dossier. "You are a liar!" Brenda screamed, her shrill voice breaking perfectly, matching the panic in her son's eyes. "You are a bitter, jealous, lying woman. You fabricated all of this garbage because you cannot stand to see my son succeed. You have always hated this family. You have always tried to drag him down to your pathetic level." I looked at my mother-in-law, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. She was defending a man who had stolen my ability to walk without pain just to buy her a fake designer handbag. "The documents are right there, Brenda," I said calmly. "They are certified corporate and federal records. Your son is going to federal prison." "I do not care about your fake papers," Brenda shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she leaned aggressively toward me across the glass table. "My son is a good man, a powerful man. He provides for this family. You are nothing but a useless leech crying on the floor and trying to ruin his big day. I will not let you disrespect him in his own home." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the sliding glass doors leading back into the house. "Pack your garbage and get out," Brenda commanded, her voice echoing across the silent patio. "Get your walker and get out of my son's house right now. You do not deserve to live in this luxury. Kendrick is divorcing you and keeping everything. Get out of Kendrick's house before I throw you out myself." The sheer blinding audacity of her demand hung in the humid Georgia air. She was actually ordering me to leave my own property. She truly believed the fairy tale Kendrick had sold her. She believed he was the master of this estate, and I was just an annoying tenant waiting to be evicted. I stood perfectly still, gripping the metal handles of my walker. I looked at Brenda's flushed, furious face. I looked at Kendrick, who was cowering against the outdoor kitchen, violently shaking, too terrified to speak. I looked at Monique and the rest of the 21 relatives who were waiting to see if I would actually retreat. And then I laughed. It started as a low, dark chuckle vibrating deep in my chest. It grew into a genuine, chilling laugh that echoed off the brick walls of the massive estate. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized she held the absolute power of life and death over the people trying to destroy her. The laughter was so out of place, so completely unnerving, that Brenda took a physical step backward, her anger faltering for a fraction of a second. "Kendrick's house?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. I tilted my head, staring directly into Brenda's terrified eyes. "You think this is Kendrick's house?" I slowly let go of the walker with my right hand reaching into the pocket of my damp hospital gown. I pulled out the final document from the manila folder, a document I had kept hidden just for this exact moment. It was a certified, notarized deed of trust, heavily stamped by the state of Georgia. I dropped it onto the glass table, right on top of the corporate termination letter. "My husband does not own a single square inch of this property," I announced, my voice ringing out with supreme, terrifying authority. "He does not own the grass you are standing on. He does not own the pool you are swimming in. And he certainly does not own the roof you slept under last night." Brenda stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Kendrick let out a pathetic whimpering noise, burying his face in his hands. He knew exactly what document I had just dropped on the table. "This $3 million estate is entirely owned by a private irrevocable trust," I explained, projecting my words to the entire crowd. "A trust that I established years before I ever made the mistake of marrying your pathetic son. He has zero equity. He has zero legal standing. He is nothing more than a temporary guest who has grossly overstayed his welcome." I took a painful step forward, closing the distance between myself and the glass table, leaning my weight heavily onto the metal frame. I locked my burning gaze onto Brenda, stripping away every last delusion she held dear. "And do you want to know the name of the corporate entity that manages my trust, Brenda?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Do you want to know the name of the company that owns everything you are currently touching?" Brenda could not speak. She shook her head slowly, her entire reality completely disintegrating. "It is owned by Aegis Health Security." I stated the name of my company, cutting through the silence like a blade. "The massive cybersecurity firm where I am the founder and chief executive officer. The company you thought was just a little freelance gig. I built a global empire while your son was busy stealing from his employers to buy your cheap approval." The total annihilation of their narrative was complete. The silence on the patio was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Brenda staggered backward, collapsing onto the outdoor sofa, her hands covering her mouth as a horrified sob ripped through her throat. Kendrick slid down the side of the outdoor kitchen cabinets, sitting on the stone pavers, pulling his knees to his chest in a state of total mental collapse. The 21 relatives stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing they had spent 2 days tormenting the woman who literally owned the ground beneath their feet. But not everyone was ready to surrender to the truth. Trent, the arrogant brother-in-law who had rested his muddy boots on my velvet chair, violently pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His face was twisted in an ugly, aggressive sneer, trying desperately to reclaim the dominance he felt he inherently deserved. He marched right up to the glass table, pointing an aggressive finger at my face. "You are completely bluffing," Trent shouted, his chest puffed out, trying to physically intimidate a woman in a back brace. "You expect us to believe you are some massive tech CEO. You are a paranoid, crazy woman trying to ruin Kendrick's life because he finally decided to dump your dead weight. None of those papers mean anything. You do not have the brains to run a global company. I am the only real tech founder in this family. I am securing $5 million next week for my algorithm, and I am going to use that money to buy you out of whatever fake trust you think you have." He took another aggressive step forward, raising his hand as if he was going to physically swat the documents off the table to silence me. "You need to shut your mouth right now," Justine Trent ordered, his voice turning dangerous. I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at him, the cold, dead smile returning to my lips. I waited for the timing to align perfectly. I knew the digital traps I had set hours ago were already closing their jaws thousands of miles away in Silicon Valley. Before Trent could take another step toward me, the silence of the backyard was shattered by a sharp, obtrusive noise. Trent's cell phone began ringing loudly from the front pocket of his expensive designer jeans. The sudden, unexpected sound made everyone jump. Trent froze, his aggressive posture faltering. He looked down at his pocket, then back up at me, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. I gestured toward his pocket with a slow, elegant wave of my hand. "You should probably answer that, Trent," I suggested, my voice soft and terrifyingly calm. "I am guessing the partners at Apex Global Ventures have a few urgent questions regarding their $5 million investment." Trent's face drained of all color, instantly matching the pale, horrifying reality setting in across the patio. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his ringing phone. Trent stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone, the bright caller ID flashing the name of the managing partner at Apex Global Ventures, the very same Silicon Valley investment firm he had been bragging about to my family all morning. His hand was shaking so violently that he almost dropped the device onto the stone patio. He looked at me, his arrogant sneer completely replaced by a hollow, terrified confusion. I just maintained my cold, dead stare, waiting for him to answer the call. He slowly raised the phone to his ear, his movements jerky and robotic. "Hello," Trent said, his voice cracking, attempting to sound like the confident tech founder he had been playing all weekend, but failing miserably. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough that I could hear the sharp, angry tones bleeding through the earpiece. Even from a few feet away, I watched as Trent's shoulders instantly slumped, his knees buckling slightly under the weight of the words being screamed into his ear. The venture capital partner was not calling to finalize the $5 million seed funding. He was calling to completely obliterate Trent's entire existence. "What do you mean, stolen?" Trent stammered, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. "No, you have to listen to me. The algorithm is mine. I wrote the code from scratch. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." The voice on the phone grew even louder, and I could clearly hear the words, "federal lawsuit" and "corporate espionage" ringing out across the quiet patio. The partner informed Trent that their legal department had just received a massive encrypted dossier containing irrefutable proof that the source code he submitted was stolen directly from Aegis Health Security. They informed him that the funding offer was permanently revoked and that their firm was officially filing a $10 million federal lawsuit against him for corporate espionage and attempting to defraud their investors across state lines. The partner told him to retain federal defense counsel and hung up the phone with a loud, aggressive click. Trent slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. The device slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered against the stone pavers. Cracking the screen, he stood there completely paralyzed, his entire fake reality violently ripped away from him in less than 60 seconds. "Did you really think a cybersecurity CEO would not have tracking code embedded in her proprietary algorithms?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air with lethal precision. "You walked into my home, you ate my food, you mocked my career, and then you plugged a hard drive into my secure server while I was bleeding on an operating table. Did you honestly believe I would just let you steal 2 years of my engineering team's hard work so you could play billionaire dress-up in Silicon Valley?" Trent could not speak. He was physically trembling, looking at me like I was a demon that had just crawled out of the earth to drag him to hell. "Every single line of code you uploaded to that offshore server was laced with invisible biometric trackers," I explained, watching his eyes widen with pure terror. "The moment you sent that stolen pitch deck to your investors, you triggered a federal corporate espionage trap. You are not a brilliant tech founder, Trent. You are a common thief, and a spectacularly stupid one. Good luck in federal court." Trent, you are going to need a very expensive lawyer, and judging by the fact that your brother-in-law just bounced a $40,000 catering bill, I am guessing this family is fresh out of liquid assets. The absolute chaos that erupted on the patio was deafening. Monique let out a piercing, horrified scream, grabbing Trent's arm and demanding to know if it was true, if he was really going to jail. Trent just pushed her away, stumbling backward until he hit the wrought iron fence, sinking down to the ground in a state of total mental collapse. He was ruined. His reputation was destroyed. His future was completely eradicated, and he was staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit that would bankrupt him before he even saw the inside of a prison cell. Brenda was sobbing hysterically, clutching her chest as she watched the two men she had praised all morning completely self-destruct before her very eyes. The 21 relatives who had flown in from Chicago were starting to panic, realizing the gravity of the situation. They began shouting at Kendrick, demanding answers, demanding to know how he was going to fix this, demanding to know how they were going to get back home. If he was broke, the wealthy neighbors and socialites who had lingered to watch the spectacle finally decided they had seen enough and began slipping out the front gate, whispering furiously to one another about the absolute trash fire of a family they had just witnessed. The catering manager and the limousine owner stood near the outdoor kitchen, their arms crossed, watching the entire family implode with grim satisfaction. But they still wanted their money, and the tension in the backyard was reaching a boiling point. Kendrick was hyperventilating, pacing back and forth, pulling at his hair, unable to form a coherent sentence. His grandiose world of luxury and dominance had been completely vaporized by the truth. That was when the heavy, measured sound of uniform boots crunching against the driveway gravel cut through the screaming relatives. Everyone on the patio stopped yelling, turning to look toward the side gate. Two local police officers dressed in crisp, dark uniforms walked purposefully into the backyard, their hands resting professionally on their duty belts. They did not look confused or alarmed. They looked incredibly bored and entirely prepared for the situation they were about to handle. They had been waiting at the end of my driveway for the past 20 minutes, exactly as I had arranged through my legal team. The officers stepped onto the patio, looking over the scattered documents on the glass table, the terrified relatives and the broken men weeping on the ground. The taller of the two officers stepped forward, raising his hand to command the attention of the hysterical crowd. "Excuse me," the officer spoke, his voice carrying the heavy, unquestionable authority of the law. "Which one of you is Justine?" I raised my hand slightly, gripping the handle of my walker. "I am officer," I replied, my voice calm and steady. The officer nodded respectfully, acknowledging me as the sole property owner. He turned his attention back to the crowd of 21 panicked relatives, the sobbing mother-in-law, the ruined brother-in-law, and my disgraced husband. "The legal owner of this property has requested that everyone not listed on the deed vacate the premises immediately," the officer announced loudly, ensuring his words reached every single person standing in my backyard. "You are all currently trespassing on private property. You have exactly 20 minutes to go inside, gather your personal belongings, and exit the estate if you are not off this property. When that time expires, you will all be placed in handcuffs and arrested for criminal trespassing. Do you understand?" The absolute pandemonium that followed the officer's announcement was like watching a bomb detonate in slow motion. The reality of their situation finally crashed down on the 21 relatives with crushing, undeniable force. They were not on a luxury vacation. They were not guests of a wealthy regional sales director. They were criminal trespassers standing in the backyard of an angry cybersecurity CEO who had just effortlessly dismantled their golden boys and sicked the police on them. "But we cannot leave," one of the aunts screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "We flew here from Chicago on budget airlines. We do not have return flights booked for another 2 weeks. We do not have money for hotels. Where are we supposed to go?" The officer simply crossed his arms. "That is not a law enforcement issue, Mom. You have 19 minutes left to gather your things. I strongly suggest you start packing. Brenda let out a guttural wailing sob, grabbing Kendrick's shirt and shaking him violently. Kendrick, you have to do something, she screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. You cannot let her throw us out on the street. Tell the police to leave. This is your house. Tell them you are her husband. Kendrick did not look at his mother. He did not look at the police officers. He slowly turned his head and looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and completely hollowed out by fear. He finally understood the absolute finality of his situation, the forged divorce papers he had thrown at me earlier, the cruel taunts, the stolen medical funds, the catered food. It had all been a pathetic delusion. He had no power, he had no money, he had no house, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already building a cage for him. Kendrick slowly walked toward me, his legs trembling with every step. He stopped a few feet away from my walker and did the one thing I knew would break his mother's heart completely. He dropped heavily to his knees, the hard stone pavers cracking loudly against his joints. "Justine," he begged, his voice nothing more than a pathetic, whimpering sob. He clasped his hands together, holding them up to me like I was a deity, holding the keys to his salvation. "Please, Justine, please stop this. You cannot do this to me. You cannot do this to my family. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I will pay you back every single penny. I will do whatever you want. Just please call the police off. Please do not throw us out. We have nothing." He was crying openly now, heavy, ugly tears rolling down his cheeks, dripping onto his pristine white linen shirt. The arrogant king of the castle was groveling on the ground, begging the fragile princess for mercy in front of the entire world. He looked so small, so utterly insignificant, kneeling there in the shadow of my estate. I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "You spent 3 days torturing me in my own home while my spine was bleeding." I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an absolute verdict. "You stole the money, meant to keep me from becoming paralyzed, so you could buy fake respect from people who do not even like you. You made your choices, Kendrick. Now you get to live with the consequences. You have 18 minutes to get out of my house before I let the officers drag you out by your hair." The 21 relatives who had spent the entire weekend ignoring my pain, eating my food and laughing at my expense, suddenly realized that Kendrick was completely powerless to save them. He was kneeling on the ground, crying like a child, and the police officers were unzipping their handcuffs, preparing to make good on their promise. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated instantly, replaced by pure panicked self-preservation. The relatives turned on Kendrick like a pack of starving wolves. An uncle stepped forward, kicking Kendrick hard in the shoulder. "You lied to us, you piece of trash!" The uncle roared, his face turning purple with rage. "You brought us all the way down here pretending you were some big-shot millionaire, and you do not even own the house you stole from your crippled wife? To buy us crab legs, you stupid fraud! How are we supposed to get home? We spent our last dollars on the plane tickets. You ruined us." Another aunt started screaming, throwing a plastic cup of champagne directly at Kendrick's head. "You drag us into a federal crime scene," she yelled, her voice hysterical. "My kids are inside that house. We are going to be homeless on the streets of Atlanta because of your pathetic lies. I hope you rot in federal prison. You lying thief." The backyard descended into an absolute violent frenzy. The relatives forgot all about me. They forgot about the police. They forgot about the luxury estate. They swarmed Kendrick, screaming, cursing, and physically shoving him as he knelt on the ground. Brenda tried to defend him, but she was pushed aside by her own sisters, who were demanding he pay for their flights home. Monique was sobbing on the ground next to Trent, who was still staring blankly at the grass, completely catatonic from the reality of his impending $10 million lawsuit. I stood quietly, leaning on my metal walker, watching the family that had tried to destroy me completely tear themselves to shreds. The police officers stepped forward, their hands resting on their weapons, shouting for the crowd to disperse and head inside to pack their bags. The catering manager and the limousine owner watched the chaos unfolding, a grim satisfaction on their faces, knowing they were about to collect their money by liquidating whatever assets Kendrick had left. The trap had closed perfectly. The destruction was absolute. The invaders were being purged from my sanctuary, and the broken, bleeding woman they thought they could walk all over was standing tall, victorious, and completely untouchable in the bright Sunday morning sun. The local police officers did not have to wait long before their federal counterparts arrived to finish the job. Two dark sport utility vehicles pulled up silently behind the chaotic blockade of catering trucks and limousines. 4 agents wearing tactical vests stepped onto the pristine brick pavers of my driveway. They bypassed the screaming relatives and walked directly onto the patio. Kendrick was still kneeling on the stone, his pristine white linen shirt now stained with dirt, sweat, and terrified tears. He did not even try to run or negotiate because he had absolutely nowhere left to go and no lies left to spin. The lead federal agent read him his rights in a flat mechanical voice, detailing the severe charges of felony wire fraud and identity theft. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly over the sounds of his family tearing themselves apart. They hoisted him to his feet and marched him past the luxury catering displays. His head hung low, completely broken and humiliated in front of the wealthy neighborhood he had tried so desperately to impress. The 21 relatives were given exactly 20 minutes to clear out of my house, and the local police enforced the deadline with zero sympathy. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in my living room, leaning heavily on my walker, watching the mass exodus unfold. Brenda was the first one out, dragging a heavy floral suitcase behind her. The sweltering Georgia heat was already pushing 90 degrees, and the thick summer humidity was absolutely suffocating. The relatives poured out of the front gate, forming a miserable procession of defeated invaders. They were screaming at each other, fighting bitterly right there on the affluent suburban sidewalk. Uncles were shoving nephews while aunts were cursing at Brenda, blaming her for raising a thief and dragging them into a federal nightmare. They had no rental cars because the limousine service had completely canceled their fraudulent contracts. They had no money for flights and no hotel reservations to fall back on. They were forced to drag their heavy luggage on foot down the long, winding streets of my wealthy neighborhood, searching for a public bus stop that was miles away. I watched my mother-in-law stumbling in her cheap heels, sweating profusely as her own sisters screamed obscenities at her. The empire she thought she ruled had evaporated, leaving her completely abandoned and disgraced on the side of the road. The house fell into a profound, beautiful quiet that wrapped around me like a warm, protective blanket. The vendors had seized what they could from Kendrick's remaining personal effects and left satisfied that the criminal was heading to a federal cell. The luxury cleaning service I hired would arrive in an hour to scrub the stench of those toxic people out of my imported carpets. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in the deep pocket of my damp hospital gown. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Monique. I answered the call, putting it on speaker so I did not have to hold the device to my ear. The sound of hysterical sobbing immediately filled my quiet home office. "Justine, please," Monique cried, her voice thick with absolute panic and desperation. "You have to help us. Trent is ruined, completely ruined. The venture capital investors filed the corporate espionage lawsuit an hour ago, and the federal prosecutors are threatening him with serious prison time. His bank accounts are frozen solid, and we have no money to hire a defense lawyer. Please, Justine, you are a multi-million-dollar CEO. You have the money to make this go away. He is my husband. Please loan us the money. We will do anything to pay you back." I listened to her pathetic begging, remembering how she had laughed at me while I cried in agony on this very floor just hours ago. I remembered how she had taken cruel photos of my pain to mock me on social media. Trent stole my intellectual property to build his fake empire. I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy or compassion, and you cheered while he did it. I hope the judge gives him the absolute maximum sentence. I tapped the red button to end the call and immediately blocked her number, permanently erasing her and the rest of that toxic bloodline from my digital and physical existence forever. Several months passed, transforming the harsh, humid summer into a crisp, beautiful autumn. My body healed with the slow, steady persistence of a true survivor. The heavy, rigid plastic spinal brace was finally removed, replaced by hours of grueling but successful physical therapy. I no longer needed the clunky metal walker to navigate the vast, open hallways of my home. Instead, I relied only on a sleek, custom-made walking cane crafted from polished dark wood that felt much more like a symbol of authority than a medical necessity. My $3 million estate was completely restored to its original glory. The ruined velvet chair was replaced, the shattered glass art was swept away, and the master bedroom was fully reclaimed and sanitized. I stepped out onto the expansive master balcony, the cool morning breeze catching the edges of my expensive silk robe. The view of the lush Georgia canopy stretching out below my property was absolutely breathtaking. I leaned comfortably against the railing, resting my elegant cane against the stone pillar, and took a slow, satisfying sip of ice-cold sweet tea. My tablet rested on the small patio table displaying the final contract for the acquisition of a promising new health tech startup. Aegis Health Security was expanding its market dominance across the globe, and my personal net worth was skyrocketing. Kendrick was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting his trial, completely bankrupt and abandoned by the very family that had turned on him the moment his stolen money ran out. Trent was facing his own federal indictment and total financial ruin. Brenda was reportedly living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment back in Chicago, working a minimum-wage retail job just to survive. I took another sip of my sweet tea, looking out over the quiet, perfectly manicured estate that belonged entirely to me. I had survived the severe physical trauma of my spine being cut open, and the deep emotional trauma of a man who tried to break my spirit to feed his own fragile ego. But they had severely misjudged the woman they were dealing with. They thought they could invade my sanctuary and feed off my hard-earned resources because they believed family ties obligated me to suffer in silence. Family isn't blood. Family isn't the people who demand you serve them while your wounds are still bleeding. True power isn't just about the money you make. It is about having the ruthlessness to take out the trash when it starts rotting in your own home. The most profound lesson from this story is that a marriage certificate or shared DNA does not give anyone the right to exploit, disrespect, or abuse you. True family should be a safe sanctuary, not a hostile environment where you are forced to serve others while you are bleeding. When toxic people mistake your quiet grace for weakness and use your most vulnerable moments to tear you down, you owe them absolutely nothing. Real power comes from knowing your immense worth, fiercely protecting your personal boundaries, and refusing to play the victim. Share your own experiences with setting hard boundaries in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories.